Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman, coming at you from Boca Raton, Florida tonight. So, we're going to start off with the real lyric of the day. This comes from a rapper, Meek Mill, off of his album Championships. This is the song Cold Hearted 2. See if I can find it. Here we go. So he says, "For the love of the millions, royalty over loyalty, never get it confused. I got real friends and family that'll never turn their back on me for the love of the money. I got a homie that's doing life. He can't offer me no money. He can't offer me nothing but a friendship and a relationship. I talk to him 7 days a week." Speaking right now, that is our guest on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you.
My friend, Chris Wycoff. And Chris is a really interesting guy. He is a life coach, a full-time computer science student at the University of Oregon, also a biology man, and remarkably, a former World Series of Poker dealer for 5 years. So Chris, we met, the summer of a couple summers ago when we were biology lab partners for that introductory sequence.
That's correct.
And, I remember just, sitting down and talking to you. And I remember that one of the first labs where you had asked something that was like very much like a biohacking question. You asked like something about like mitochondrial function or something. And I'm like, oh man, like this guy must be into like some of the same stuff I'm into. So I remember after that I struck up a conversation with you. I don't know if
you did. Yeah, I recall.
Yeah.
Sure.
But then we just started talking, got into, the different supplements we're into and fasting and a lot of the stuff we'll talk about in the podcast today. But, Chris, just a very fascinating guy and has definitely lived quite a lot of different sort of lives, I would say.
Well, I mean, for male white American, I probably have lived more lives than that demographic generally does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, I've lived very privileged life overall. And I almost screwed it all up, but now I think I'm back on the right track. So.
Okay. Yeah. Curious. We'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
However much you want to get into, but
sure.
I'm curious if you could first off kind of just tell me a little about. I think I've heard part of the story, but you could just tell me and our listeners, about kind of what first got you interested in this whole idea of being able to sort of modify and control our biology, and now it's evolved into this very popular concept of biohacking. How did you, or why did you originally get into that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say popular. I mean, I think that it's more emergently popular. And you still meet a lot of resistance to the idea of biohacking, right? Because a lot of people believe that their mentality, their physicality is somewhat set. They can't really change it that much. Maybe they can go to the gym, maybe they can eat healthier, but overall, nothing's really going to change. And that's kind of the mentality that I tend to reject these days. In terms of my own personal journey with biohacking, it really started out of desire and bordering on a necessity for myself to get healthier. In 2014, I was pretty ill. I had really bad inflammatory bowel disease. I was super badly composed in terms of like my body composition. I was like skinny fat, super skinny fat. I was having GERD, which is like gastrointestinal reflux disorder. And I was going to see specialists. This is part of the time in my life when I was poker dealing, and they were just saying that I was stressed and that there's nothing that like they could really do about it. And so around that time is when I started seeking out different answers outside the mainstream medical community. And what I found was that a lot of the stuff that we do in our daily lives is fairly toxic. And if you just start cutting some of those things out, the body will tend to heal itself. So that being the core kind of tenet of what I'm trying to do personally is like allow the body to do what it does best.
Right. Right. So yeah, I mean that definitely seems like there was kind of the need. You were kind of curious as far as why this stuff was going on, and I think it's something where we usually, if everything's working right and we're feeling good all the time, most people wouldn't have, the need to really biohack things. But then it's like, once we start seeing problems that aren't necessarily, it's not like you have a tumor that you can see on an MRI and doctors can go in and look at it and take it out. It's something where it's like we're talking. I mean, I feel like biohacking is like incredibly complex, where I mean, you could get further and further into it where you're just analyzing, the composition of a single, plant compound, right? Where it's, it's very in depth, and a lot of it we don't know as far as exactly what like what is going to be right for one person versus what's going to be right for another person. But I mean, I think a lot of the like latest, with genes, as we learn more about genes and the environment, epigenetics, I think is a super cool field. But I think biohacking, I think you're right that it's something that maybe is not popular in the very much like the mainstream right now, but I feel like it's definitely getting there. I mean, it's gotten to a point where people I feel like are more aware that we're kind of living in this world. Like maybe it's people realizing just their own unhappiness with either how they feel or just, their stress levels and stuff. But, I feel like the biohacking like goes along with kind of the wave of like meditation and yoga, how that's all become, I feel like more and more people are kind of gravitating towards those practices, I think, out of a sense of like unhappiness or maybe unfulfillment. Do you subscribe to that at all, or?
Yeah, so I think that the practice of biohacking is still being defined, what that is. What if I was to hazard a definition, it might be the practice of physical intervention in order to improve one's metabolism, essentially. And I use the word metabolism pretty loosely, whether that be in the body and, the brain also has a metabolism in my opinion. So the field of biohacking, I think, right now appeals to two fairly dichotomized sets of populations. So potentially people who are maybe where I was, where you're having some medical issues that really the mainstream medical community is having a hard time addressing. So in my case, it was essentially inflammation and poor gut health, poor gut microbiome health. So you have, and those seem to go hand in hand. So you have body inflammation, and then I have brain fog, which is essentially inflammation in the brain.
Yeah.
If you look at it from a more macro sense. And then part of what was causing that inflammation is just like overgrowth of yeast in my gut is what I determined. So those kind of diagnostic tools are really only available if you look at more to the fringe of the medical community. So like if you want to, just for anybody listening who may be having some kind of issues that they're not having resolved by the mainstream medical community, if you go and see a functional medicine doctor, the functional medicine doctors have to have an additional certification beyond their medical degree that requires them to actually take nutrition classes and take new hormonal classes, things like that, both of which are not required to get a medical degree. So you don't
Right.
ever have to do any kind of nutritional training,
I
which
had
is
heard,
like absurd in my opinion.
yeah, I'd heard like throughout, I was talking to a buddy, like throughout the course of his med school program, there were like 5 or 6 lectures, that were like devoted to nutrition,
Right.
So it's like, yeah, it was so minimized to the point where, um, it's like a lot, I think, you talk to a lot of like Western or just conventional like doctors or people that just subscribe to those notions, and it's sort of a thing of like, well, if we can't see it, if we can't like see it on an X-ray or MRI, and we can't see that you have some kind of infection, it's like they kind of throw their hands up. Whereas I think with the functional medicine, it's kind of more looking at like kind of the root cause of what is actually going on, like like you were able to figure out, like maybe you're having the gut issues because of the yeast overgrowth, or is some part
Yeah.
of that. I think the thing you touched on about like the brain inflammation super key too, because
Hmm.
that's something like everyone can realize or understand the concept of inflammation, like when you stub your toe and you know whatever, break your toe, and your toe inflames as a reaction to that.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
we don't see that in the brain. I mean, we see that to if there's a traumatic brain injury and we were to do a look at someone's brain, but just on kind of a day-to-day level, we can't see our brains, so we can't exactly see the inflammation. But at the same time, when you think about something like, oh, why am I not thinking clearly today? Why am I not remembering that word that I usually am able, like it's those things. For me, that was really what got me interested, where it was like I noticed such a deviation in like my mental performance,
Hmm.
just day to day. And I always was curious, like, oh, like, is it, is there like a specific number of hours I need to sleep to be able to like feel the way I want to feel? Or is it like the diet? And like, so I think from a young age, I was kind of already like, trying to piece parse the pieces together or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's certainly an interesting thing, and the concept of really being able to actually like own, the fact that we all own our biology is, I
Mm.
think, something that's revolutionary for a lot of people who tend to think, I think they're stuck in sort of that fixed old mindset where it's like, oh, I'm going to go to the doctor and they know what's best, they're in control of my health. And
Right.
it's like people are starting to, I think, realize that it's like, no, like, we know more and more about how all of these very common diseases that are kind of plaguing, especially Western society now, are so much driven by lifestyle, so much, by, the excessive amount of sugar in our diet and lack of exercise and, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And
Chronic
we feel,
illness,
yeah,
like you said, is on the rise hugely, and potentially the culprit of that is, um, like you said, poor lifestyle, and also the inability for the large health institutions to adapt. Um, like you said, they're really good at treating acute injury, acute disease. Like you have a virus, you have a acute infection, you've been shot in the head. We're really good at treating those kinds of things. Like surgery, is amazing. The way that they're able to save people now, um, is incredible. Like the success rates on, combat injury, uh, saving people, things like that, like are as far as I can tell, really good. But like you said, when it comes to like chronic inflammation, you have like a chronic disease that developed over time, like type 2 diabetes. Like, man, the mainstream medical community reacts really poorly to that. So, yeah,
Hmm.
well, it's a good point you have there.
Yeah, yeah. So biohacking kind of being this emerging sort of, you know, I think paradigm shift in terms of, how we kind of view our own health and disease. But I'm curious as far as, you've done a lot of, I mean, we've both done a lot of experimentation as far as trying out different things, but,
Yeah.
out of all the things you've done, I'm curious, I'm gonna guess, fasting is gonna be one of the things you'll say because we talk so much about that. But what,
Mhm.
maybe fasting or what other things have you found to kind of be the most profound and impactful biohacks for you personally?
Well, but you hit the nail right on the head there. Fasting, the abstaining of consumption of food and sometimes even water in some kind of cases where I've experimented with doing dry fasting has certainly been far and away the most powerful biohack that I've tried. In terms of non-fasting biohacks,
Well, actually, maybe if we just stick on the concept or the topic of fasting for now,
yeah,
I think people would be really curious if you could, can you break down, say the differences between, you mentioned the
yeah,
dry versus, water fast. Why would someone want to, say someone, has heard a little about the benefits of fasting but doesn't know a lot about it.
hmm
Why would someone want to restrict water? What's the benefit there, doing a dry fast?
So if you did a dry fast, first of all, I would probably only recommend doing a dry fast to someone who's has a fairly good body composition and has already done fasting with water. So just right off the bat, it's kind of more advanced technique. One of the main benefits is that it puts you into potentially a deeper type of ketosis, and you actually start to burn fat at some of the more visceral level even more quickly because fat can actually be changed to water in the body, but we can't quite do it quick enough to save ourselves in like a drought situation. We can't just like survive off fat for water for months like we can for food.
Hmm.
Um, so, in terms of being what I would call metabolically flexible, where maybe you wanted to have your body be in a metabolic spot where you could survive an extra day, 2, 3, 4 days without water, if that was something that appealed to you, just having a more robust and flexible metabolism, then that doing a dry fast is a good way to strengthen your metabolism, put a little stress on it,
Hmm.
and then when you come back to the normal, then you're going to be a little more flexible going forward. So I've noticed since I've done dry fasts that I don't get thirsty too often, not
Hmm.
nearly as much as I used to. And when I do, I'll drink, but it's like I can play tennis for an hour or two and not take a drink. Whereas before, when I used to play tennis, just like I run it every game. I'd be running to the water bottle, that kind of thing. So
Interesting.
obviously, this anecdotal, but
Yeah.
yeah,
No, that's an interesting thing that you notice. I'm curious, like it just gets me thinking if there is some kind of like something that got kind of regenerated or kind of healthier cells formed like in the hypothalamus, what releases a lot of the hormones involved in kind of controlling our desire to drink, or control if we're thirsty or not. So
could
yeah,
be.
maybe there's some kind of hormonal thing going on there too, but it's certainly an interesting thing that you noted with that.
Yeah.
And then as far as, um, I mean, from what I kind of understand about fasting, it seems to be one of those things that you sort of touched on it, where it's sort of like you're giving the stress to your metabolism with the goal that it kind of rebuilds at a higher level, and that it sort of seems similar to like exercise, something like
Yeah,
physical exercise in a lot of ways, where you're not actually, building muscle when you're lifting weights, you're tearing
right.
down the muscle, but you're giving your muscles that stress, in
Absolutely.
hopes that those muscles are gonna react to that stress proactively and get bigger and stronger. Do you view fasting kind of in a similar light?
I definitely do. And that's an analogy that I've been making a lot these days is that, you're not going to fast and then have better performance during your fast. That's kind of like, if you do, then you really needed to fast. Like I have seen it, right, where people will fast and then they were so bogged down with inflammation that their performance actually goes up during a fast, right?
Mm,
But that's not where you ought to be optimally, in my opinion. It's like you're saying, when you stop, so let's say you're going to do a 24-hour fast. You're going to stop eating food, but you're going to drink water. You're going to just do a regular food fast. And so you should see a fairly steadily declining mental performance, just because you're going to have less free glucose available to your brain. Um, and you might see a small uptick in mental performance after about 40 hours, when your uh, body will go enter ketosis, for example. You might have
mm,
a little bit of an uptick, but you're probably not going to be at a performance where you would be if you, say, just got up, had a very small amount of sugar, maybe a little caffeine, like a tiny bit of protein, and then you went and took a test, or
mm,
had a job interview, something like that. That's what I would recommend for peak mental performance. But it's like you said, when you do a fast, you're putting heavy stress on your body. Your body is doing a bunch of stuff, including cellular recycling, which we can talk about
mm.
more.
Yeah.
And it's breaking itself down and then building itself back up stronger, certainly. So that way, it's like a big investment in your metabolism.
Hmm. And
That's
do
the
you
way I
think
view it.
yeah. And do you think, I was actually just making this connection because last time I saw you,
Hmm.
what had resulted from, your arms kind of getting inflamed, from
Mm-hmm.
lifting too much, and
Yeah.
it sort of just made me draw the connection of like, can you sort of put too much stress on your body with fasting, do you think? Or is it something where your body, like, you'll just get to a point where your body and brain is just like, eat, like, because I mean, is it, I don't know. I mean, can
Yeah.
you overdo it or?
Yeah. So the rule that I've come to know is that the thing that you're at risk of, as a normal person, someone who has, like, over 18% body fat, something like that, which is the vast majority of people have, well over 15, 18% body fat. If you're in the more normal body fat range and you don't have any kind of like metabolic disorder, and you're not ill in any way, the thing that you're at most risk at um, is running out of micronutrients. So,
Mm,
like running out of potassium, running out of an electrolyte, right?
mm-hmm,
Something like that. That's where you're at most risk at, because you will run out of electrolytes and nutrients before you run out of energy.
mm,
So it's not gonna. You're not, if you were to have some kind of uh, damaging event during a fast, it wouldn't be because your body is not able to produce ATP, which is the way that the body um, changes fat and sugar into energy. You wouldn't run out of ATP, you'd run out of magnesium, or you'd
mm-hmm,
run out of sodium or potassium and have some kind of event that might damage you.
mm-hmm,
So one of the things to do if you're going to be doing fasting is have a very rich nutritive diet when you're not fasting. you know
mm-hmm,
don't This is kind of like why potentially the more, classical way of losing weight has been like go on a diet, right? Just like don't eat a lot and kind of, maybe even like eat only this one thing or
Hmm.
whatever. And that puts you at risk for nutrient deficiency, right? So that's why, for me, if I'm advising people to lose weight, then, I'd like them to either go on some kind of like nutrient rich ketogenic diet or simply have like a nutrient rich, normal diet and
Hmm.
do fasting.
Right. Right. And what about, I mean, do you personally use, vitamins or minerals during the fast, or is that something where you're saying it's just a better idea to kind of replenish them or go into a fast with good levels, from eating a healthy diet? But would you actually incorporate those into a fast?
I think that if I was doing fasts for more than 7 to 10 days, I would start to consider it. But for me personally, I'm not really doing fast for more than 7 days, and I'm being someone who eats like a pretty rich diet. I'm not really going to be at risk of that. I
Mhm.
know that there have been cases. So, for example, the longest fast that has been documented was over 400 days,
I think you told
and
me about that.
it's
Yeah.
it's a case study that was published of a severely like morbidly obese
Mhm.
person who, with their doctor, decided that they were going to do a fast and document it, and he had to take um, multivitamins and
Sure.
things like that, but because otherwise he probably would have died. Um, but lo and behold, he took the vitamins, didn't have any calories. Maybe maybe there was some like rice starch in the supplement or something like that, but probably less than 5 calories a day for over a year, and he was fine. So,
And what
um,
I noticed particularly interesting about that, and I think you were the one that told me about that. And
mhm,
when you first said that, when I first got, heard about that, I was like, no way, that's not possible that he went that long. And lo and behold, anyone can look it up and it's true. But what I thought was super fascinating was that I think they did, I don't know if it was like a year or what the timeline was with the follow-up, but the guy was actually able to keep off the weight. Once he started
yeah,
eating again, it had somehow reset his metabolism that year long of fasting. So that was super fascinating to me because I think a lot of people, um, I personally can't really relate because I've always been kind of, underweight and trying to bulk up. But I think a lot of people go, they go on a diet, they restrict their what they eat or how much they eat a lot,
hmm
and then they sort of hit a plateau and then start gaining the weight back. And I am sure everyone listening, we all know someone who keeps going back and forth between
right.
losing weight on a fast versus so I think it's super fascinating that like something like that case study where it showed that it's actually possible to be able to sort of fix different bodily functions, maybe stabilize the function of some organs. I don't know, the pancreas, is definitely a big one that I know is, definitely gets a rest when you're fasting. From what I've understood about it, that is kind of a big benefit to fasting, right? Is where, because I guess just for people who aren't super aware, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I say anything wrong here, but um, just sort of a primer on how the pancreas actually or why it's actually important, with this discussion. So,
Mm-hmm.
when you take in, glucose, in the form of carbs and, sugar, um, it sort of, sends the signal for your pancreas to secrete insulin. And, what
Hmm.
what happens is, oftentimes, the pancreas is good for a while at actually pumping out proper amounts of insulin to deal with all of the excess, all the glucose coming in. But
Hmm.
then you get to a point where we commonly with our Western diets, we eat so much carbs, we take in so much glucose that those insulin cells stop working as well. They become inefficient, like a condition known as insulin desensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
So from what I've understood about fasting, it seems like one of those things where, you know, if we're constantly eating, we're never really giving our pancreas a full break where it doesn't have to constantly be pumping out all of the all of its hormones. Do you see that as a part of the fasting benefits?
To a certain extent, yes. I'm sure that your pancreas definitely gets a break, as well as almost all of your tissues kind of like get somewhat of a break because there's not nearly as much influx and efflux in your cells. Um, and like you said, when you take in sugar or a carbohydrate more specifically, your insulin does spike. So the rule of thumb is that fat spikes insulin the least, but it still does bring up insulin secretion, and then protein, and then at the top is carbohydrates. And also, there's emerging research that when you mix carbs and fat or protein and carbs or any of those macronutrients, any of the three macronutrients, anytime you mix them, then there's almost like a amplification of how much insulin and other associated hormones like end up getting released. So anytime you have something like a donut that is like carbs, fat, and protein potentially also, then you're going to be like shooting your insulin like up a ton.
Right.
And the insulin resistance actually can occur throughout your entire body, not just in the pancreas, where the cells no longer respond to insulin. So that's why you have diabetics with high blood sugar, because the insulin's there, but the cells are like, no, I'm not opening up to receive the sugar because I'm just like not, I have a high tolerance to insulin now. So that is what one of the biggest and most obvious benefits to fasting is your insulin goes basically to zero. Your blood insulin is essentially non-existent, and all your cells get to kind of recover their tolerance to insulin. So that way, not only will that improve any kind of like diabetes or pre-diabetes symptoms, that's kind of like the far end, but even for people who don't necessarily have a problem, they will start to take up on a cellular level nutrients much better than they did before if they had never fasted. So even if you're like someone who's trying to gain muscle like you or put on more mass, it may be that some of your muscle cells could benefit from having a break from insulin, and then when you come back at them with the high nutrition diet that you probably are on, then they're going to be able to be more tolerant to taking that up. So even if you're not overweight, and you're just kind of a normal person, fasting just from a metabolic food energy standpoint, not to mention the cancer reduction benefits and stuff like that we might get into, there's pretty upfront benefits that you can receive.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point as far as, insulin's effect on all different sort of tissues and organs and muscle, throughout your body. What particularly interests me, just, since I'm a like neurophysiology researcher, is, looking at the stuff as far as, there's a subset of researchers who are now calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes
Yeah.
because there's such a strong link between the high blood sugar being directly toxic to neurons.
Yeah.
Where obviously you need blood sugar, glucose, and ketones being the two kind of fuel sources for your brain, and you obviously need a certain amount of glucose to be able to think and be alive, uh, you know, but I think for the majority of people, it's having a huge overabundance of glucose, and that's where we're seeing kind of the toxic effects on cells, particularly. I mean, the brain's particularly sensitive, so I think I'm super curious to see the future of kind of research in that field. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, especially with Alzheimer's not having, a drug that has a high degree of efficacy, it may be something like fasting. I don't know if did you read Dale Bredesen's work, his End of Alzheimer's book?
No.
I'd highly recommend that to you as well as the audience. It's basically, he's a doctor, I believe a neurosurgeon out of UCLA, researcher. So he's kind of put together this Bredesen protocol that is supposed to, sort of treat. The way he explains it is that Alzheimer's is kind of the result of the roof falling down, where the roof's not going to fall down if there's all just a couple tiny holes. But,
Yeah.
once you get, so continuing the analogy, it's sort of like, okay, we know, that, high blood sugar is one of those holes, and we know, toxic elements, like mercury, that fits into the equation,
Yeah.
so it's like all of these things that he sort of pieces together, and his protocol is sort of, fixing, plugging as many holes as you possibly can. I think it definitely aligns with the functional medicine kind of approach that we were talking about in the beginning, I think, where we're kind of looking at the body as a full system, um,
Yeah.
and not just directly on a disease, but what's kind of causing your body to perform well or
Interesting.
not well.
Yeah, I'm just reading the blurb about the book, and it seems like he's outlining 36 metabolic factors, micronutrient,
Yes.
hormone levels, sleep, etc., that can trigger
Yeah.
downsizing in the brain. Very interesting.
And what
Yeah.
I was gonna say is, or I don't think I mentioned it, was, he's a big proponent of fasting. Everyone I think on that protocol is like a 16, the 16-hour fasting, 8-hour eating window. So he definitely talks about the benefits as far as brain health, and you
Yeah.
know, sure we're going to continue to learn more as far as fasting and its effects on the brain, and if it can be efficacious and maybe preventing. I think especially preventing. I think that seems to be the best way of dealing with these neurodegenerative diseases. You don't want to start treating them once they've begun. You want to like live a healthy lifestyle so you don't set yourself up to actually develop them,
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely.
But I'm curious, kind of moving a little away from fasting,
Yeah.
what other biohacks have you found to be most impactful that you've noticed the biggest difference from?
Well, exercise could be considered a biohack.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that that's probably one of the most prominent biohacks that people are doing, and they don't even really categorize it as such, right? But
Mhm.
you know, clearly, I think it's just irrefutable at this point that exercise, although it's effortful and it requires some amount of skill and mental and physical effort, obviously, as I said, benefits your long-term physical goals, right?
Mhm.
And you're going to be generally not only physically more able, but mentally more able as well. Um, so I would categorize that as hugely beneficial biohack.
Mhm.
But
And I
that kind
think,
of goes without saying. Um, Sorry, go ahead.
well, I was sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, I mean, you're very good at kind of parsing apart all the research, and really digging in deep.
Hmm.
And exercise is one of those things where it's like, some people could define exercise as, taking a walk around the block, whereas other people it's like, powerlifting in the gym.
Yeah.
And I think, I've seen certainly a lot of stuff come out nowadays about like the high intensity interval training
Yeah,
which I think we've talked about that you're a
yeah,
fan of, right? But
definitely.
I mean, do you see in the research any trend as far as what form of exercise is going to be kind of produce the most bang for your buck per se?
From the research that I've done, it appears that resistance training, otherwise known as weightlifting, is probably the most beneficial thing that you can do. Um, the From a hormonal standpoint, you're going to promote like the release of growth hormone and testosterone, which is good for both men and women. Um, among several other hormones that you're going to be promoting, and that's going to be huge. Not to mention that a lot of the decline that we see in elderly people is because they don't have the structural support of their tissues, holding them up anymore, because you know obviously there's a certain inevitable decline that occurs, but a lot of people have never lifted weights in the last 20-30 years, if ever, in their lifetime, and then they're having like back issues where they can't stand up straight and they can't walk and stuff like that, and then it's potentially because they've never really you know strained their body to the point where they had to you know promote growth hormone in the body and things like that.
Hmm.
In addition, walking appears to be really good for your mentality, and also for like your posture and for your nervous system. But in terms of more like your tissues, you know, resistance training, and also high intensity kind of like plyometric, or sprinting, something that where you're almost doing resistance training with your own body, that kind of thing,
Hmm.
seems to be the most beneficial. um,
Yeah, there's some the interesting research as far as sprinting. I noticed in particular that they've found to promote BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, so
mhm.
increasing the growth of new neurons, the new connections amongst brain cells. And that's something that actually I believe fasting does too, right?
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
seen, yeah, some stuff that it promotes BDNF. So that may be another mechanism in which it kind of strengthens brain performance along with exercise.
yeah.
And I mean it,
Oh, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I've read that that you can increase the amount that you actually retain information by exercising after a learning
Yeah,
experience. So,
yes,
and
I've seen the
I
same.
wouldn't be surprised if it's directly related with the release of BDNF and potentially other hormones that we may or may not even know about. It seems like they're always like, oh, we discovered this new internal biological feature that we have. So, uh,
Right.
which is kind of like you have to take all of this stuff that we're saying and other people are saying with a grain of salt, because biology is like still a fast expanding frontier of knowledge.
Right.
So
Yeah, me and you are we're probably gonna look back at this podcast in like 10 years and be like, man, we were idiot. Like but I feel like that's just the general like research in general, especially with the brain. It's evolving so quickly, and there's so much we still don't know that
right,
I think it's going to be astonishing, what we see with these different things in 5, 10 years. Within easily within our lifetime, I think there's going to be huge discoveries and changes.
yeah,
But
probably.
yeah,
Hopefully we won't think that we're idiots, but maybe we just didn't quite know this or that yet.
yeah,
And
that's a better way to put it.
to a certain extent, um, what you're saying is, it reminds me of something that I believe David Asprey said in his book, um, about biohacking. One of them could have been Headstrong, I think maybe it was. And what he said in his book is that you can either like wait for the research to come in, and where we understand everything that's going on,
Hmm.
or you can just start to do the things that seem to be pretty obviously working. for people who are at the forefront of this kind of, biohacking field, they're like, this is kind of working. We're not, we don't have every single hormonal step, clinically researched, but, like you can wait or you can just go for it. And I tend to be the guy who just goes for it. So
Yeah,
that makes
definitely same.
sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wanna transition a little bit. Well, as far as I think this is a good transition into, you've kind of, you know, you're so well versed in a lot of, different, whether it be biology or now computer science, psychology, a lot of these different disciplines where you've you've sort of synthesized this knowledge and then basically put it into practice with your life coaching program or
Yeah.
company, right?
Hmm.
Tell me a little about how where the where did the inspiration for that kind of come from, and then kind of what's rewarding about doing that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So I've done a decent amount of lifestyle, nutrition, and mentality coaching over the last 5 or 6 years. I'm not doing as much of it right now because I'm kind of at the tail end of my computer science degree that I'm doing. So I've tapered off, taking on as many clients. But yeah, for the last several years, I've tried to identify with the clients that I've had, what their goals are, because I think that having long-term goals is like one of the first steps toward being happier. And then also identifying body composition goals and also, energy level goals that people have and move towards those. So if you mix kind of classical motivational psychology with having noticeably higher energy because you're doing physical biohacking intervention on somebody, that seems to be a good mix of inputs and intervention that end up kind of catapulting people towards what I would call like real happiness, which is essentially
Hmm.
just strength, mental, physical, emotional strength, and the ability to delay gratification, which is much easier if you're feeling like you have a high amount of energy on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting topic within itself about, just happiness and, it's like whether I mean, I tend to subscribe to the notion where it's more like, if you can get, every cell in your body firing, as well as they can be, you should feel very energized and you should feel happy. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of different, sort of debates as far as, what are kind of causes of unhappiness and whether it's kind of like brought about by your life, societal things or
Hmm.
just kind of like past, obviously like me being in kind of the field of psychology, there's like a lot of, oh, you're feeling this way because of past,
Trauma.
childhood trauma, which
Yeah.
I'm not going to completely dismiss as BS, but at the same time, the reason I kind of gravitated more towards neuroscience is because it's a lot more like things we can quantify as far as like and actually like improve where
Hmm.
even though we don't know a lot or we don't know a ton, uh, but at the same time, something where it's like you're never really going to know if the fact that your fifth grade teacher picked on you, whether that is, playing a part in how, you're
Mm.
functioning as an adult right now.
Hmm. Well, I don't, advertise myself as someone who knows how to deal with huge amounts of PTSD or trauma, something like that. But from what I've come to understand is that trauma is certainly a real thing, and to a large extent, what trauma ends up being, down the line is maladaptive survival mechanisms, whether that be, of more physical or more emotional survival mechanism, and then it's no longer appropriate in the context of your life in the future, but that's now ingrained in you. So like if something traumatic, something kind of out of the ordinary, something really bad ends up happening to you, then potentially during that time of your life, just to survive emotionally, you had to develop this kind of like unhealthy mental habit that then down the line is like, you know, throwing you way out of whack when you're in a more normal scenario again, because you just like are tuned into this not normal, unhealthy, traumatic scenario. And you know, that is something, one of the hardest things to repair. But in terms of people who maybe just have more, haven't been educated about how to set goals, how to end up achieving a long-term goal, that's more where I come in, and bridging the gap between like your emotional life and your physical life, I think is really important, because one of the things that I've found most effective towards achieving goals is doing things that are physically hard, right? Because achieving goals is somewhat of an emotional journey or an intellectual journey. But if you're, you know, for example, if you're waking up every day and you're taking like an ice bath and then you're like lifting weights and then you're going about your intellectual day, nothing seems quite as hard, I think, after that. So those kind of things where you're bridging that gap between your intellectual and your physical life, because we are physical beings. There's no getting around that. In, you know, at least now we're not cyborgs yet.
Not
so yet. I think it's important to embrace that kind of like dynamic between our like mental and physical metabolism, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think that's very, very well put. I'm curious, you know, as far as kind of taking a 180 or 360 turn, you know, it's interesting that now you're, you know, in this sort of line of work, but you used to, you know, be doing something very, very different, which was, you know, as a dealer in the World Series of Poker, and that's something certainly not a lot of people can put on their job resume as something that they've done. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty interesting thing. That was before I met you, but what and just I think you've told me a little about just your path into poker, but tell me about kind of, you know, how you got into it, and then, you know, maybe talk about some lessons, and maybe actually relating it back to the life coaching, because you talked to me about, you know, last time we talked in person when I was in Eugene a few weeks ago, and you know, you were talking to me about that phenomena that is, you know, occurs with the poker players, right? I believe it was something about negativity.
I think you're referring to loss aversion.
Loss aversion, that was it. Yeah. But if you could just kind of tell me about, I mean, it seems like, you know, you having actually done that, you're kind of a lot more qualified to be able to understand what sort of goes behind that sort of mentality. So if you could just talk a little about that.
Yeah, certainly. So maybe we'll bring it back to loss aversion in a second.
Sure.
When I was 21 years old, I got trained as a poker dealer here in Eugene. And part of the reasons I got trained as a poker dealer was because it was a way for me to make a decent amount of money in a short amount of time so I could continue to live my like lazy video game all day, every day lifestyle. So as kind of like interesting as it may seem, to a certain extent, being a poker dealer was a symptom of a poor and less than optimal in terms of the long-term consequences lifestyle.
Okay.
What it also may be is that I tend to be maybe better than average at identifying like the best line of work to be in given my current motivation. So, for example, now I'm looking into, becoming a computer scientist and then potentially continuing in my education in Internet of Things and AI, machine learning. And I think that, probably a lot of people would agree, especially if you're technical, that seems to be where like a lot of, money is flowing and a lot of like things are going in the world towards automation, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily a bad field to be in versus like, maybe, historical anthropology or something like that might not be as like good of a lucrative of a undergrad to be pursuing.
Right.
No
offense to all the historical anthropologists out there.
There aren't enough museum jobs out there for everyone. And
man, it's a bummer.
So, yeah, I mean, by all means, but that's an interesting dynamic, right? When you're on a podcast, you have to really be careful what you say to a certain extent, because like any off the cuff remark could be, construed against you. So
I thought about that a lot, actually. I mean, because obviously probably people listening to it right now are probably the, amongst the first people listening, probably a lot of family, friends, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe this does one day become, bigger and, just kind of a little bit of a plug. We've got some very cool guests coming up.
Sounds like
to be on the podcast. So hopefully, with their bigger audiences and reach, you bring up a good point where it's like, yeah, like you do really have to. I was thinking about this a lot as far as, obviously I wanted, and I think we're doing a good job of making it very kind of a genuine interaction where, we're not, putting on these facades and pretending, you're trying to make ourselves like look good or, or just kind of be fake. But at the same time, there's obviously, stuff that maybe even if you say it and it's somewhat debatable, like, or it's somewhat like open for interpretation, especially we see this a lot in the media, people will tend to just take something and run with it, even if it wasn't actually your intention.
Sure. Well, hopefully they start writing inflammatory articles about you, Toby.
I mean, they say any news is good news, right? Or so
any media is good or whatever. Yeah. Probably. Yeah, I mean, just ask Donald.
Bring it on. So I should just say something right now that's gonna get me in a bunch of trouble. But
yeah, man, like climate change, something like that. Like start saying stuff about like gender stuff. Yeah.
Right.
All
very sensitive subjects right now. Yeah.
Just trigger all the snowflakes, dude.
Everyone. Yeah.
All right. Anyways, I can kind of long story short what we were talking about. And anyways, I ended up becoming trained as a poker dealer. I moved to Las Vegas shortly after that, got a job at the World Series of Poker. You actually audition for that, so you sit around a table and there's a judge, and they say, okay, deal this poker game, deal Texas Hold'em, and these are the blinds, and these are the chip stacks, and go, and then you deal that hand, and or they say, oh, deal this Omaha game, these are the chip stacks, and this is the situation, this is what this player did, and then you deal that. And so it's kind of an interesting experience, and I ended up getting job, just barely got it, but I got it. And this is after about 2 months of being a dealer. And yeah, I ended up traveling around the country and spending a lot of time in Las Vegas as a poker dealer. Was able to work pretty intensely for a week here and there, and then take a bunch of time off and play video games in my apartment all day with my future wife, who is like amazing that she put up with that. And yeah, so it was a decent way to make a living. It's this, service industry job, but ended up, seeing some celebrities at my table, and especially poker celebrities, some of the big poker celebrities, dealt to all of them. And yeah, so it served a purpose to allow me to have this kind of freedom that I needed during my early 20s. But poker and the poker industry, to a certain extent, provides less value than a lot of other industries to society, because you're not creating anything new. You're just playing a game. And to a large extent, the majority of people playing poker are losing money, and only a very small subset of poker players are making money. And poker players don't tend to be very like charitable. They tend to be kind of like grumpy and and greedy. You almost have to be to a certain extent, But that being said, there is a small amount of poker players who are wonderful. I don't mean to paint everyone with such a large brush, and that ties into what makes the majority of poker players kind of grumpy and maybe not as happy as they could be, is the loss aversion that we alluded to earlier. If you wanted to talk about that for a moment, if you're someone who's had experience with poker players, you probably would agree that a lot of them are kind of like I said before, easily irritable type of people. Maybe they tend to be a little short and angry, and maybe they just kind of have a sense of discontentedness. And I think that where that comes from is this phenomenon called loss aversion. So poker is a game where if you're winning, you generally are kind of like flipping a coin over and over in terms of the odds, and maybe you're coming out 5-10% ahead, but over time you're losing a hand, winning a hand, losing a hand, winning a hand, losing a hand, winning a hand, and then maybe you win 2 hands in a row, and there's your edge, right? If you're an excellent poker player. And what can end up happening is, because of the psychological phenomenon called loss aversion, which is that if you lose $1 and you win $1, then you're upset. And that comes from this kind of deep, fundamental, evolutionary phenomena that humans really do not like to lose a resource, because if you lose a resource, that might end up killing you. It's more likely that you'll end up dying because of a lost resource than living because of a gained resource. So then if you lose and win the same amount of resources, then it's going to be a net emotional loss. And if you're constantly winning and losing, winning and losing, winning and losing, and your edge is very small, then even though you may be winning, maybe you are part of the top 10% of poker players that are winning, you're probably still going to fall into the category of people who are emotionally losing. And that's where loss aversion can take a toll on poker players and other people who potentially have a profession where their lifestyle is mimicking that kind of large amount of outcomes edge. Maybe if you're into day trading or stocks, maybe something like that could also take a toll on you.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we think of like these kind of hyper competitive professions like that, but and we associate it with, high amounts of stress, and obviously not all forms of stress are bad. Sometimes if there's some, stress that's causing you to, do good work in the world, cause you to have, the desire to go out and, do your life coaching. Obviously
Yeah,
that's a good stress, but it's interesting when you break down as far as why, why there's that kind of archetype of, like the stressed out, like, going crazy stockbroker or whatever. Because we kind of think about like, why is that really so? But I think that really makes sense, at least in part, with that concept of loss aversion. Because, um,
yeah,
if you're always kind of, living your life in fear, we could, kind of, I could bring it to a neuroscience perspective where it's, kind of talking about, you're really activating, a lot your limbic system, and as far as kind of the emotional um, kind of reaction to a lot of those, you know, risk taking and winning and losing, and something like that is where you're constantly, running on all of these different, high, having all these highs and lows that make sense that that may not be the healthiest kind of way to live.
yeah,
But
potentially. Yeah, and the late nights probably don't
late
don't
nights,
help poker players either.
right? It's interesting now that you've sort of been able to synthesize all of kind of your different sort of interests or career paths,
Mm.
or studies, and then actually some of your clients, as you were telling me last time, actually are poker players, and
Yeah,
even though they are in this kind of demanding position, you were telling me, just the fact that if they can understand the concept
hmm
of loss aversion, that may actually help them out, right?
yeah, because loss aversion, my assumption is that it's a pretty deep psychological phenomena, and when I say deep, I mean it's not a newly evolved psychological phenomenon. I'm assuming that most mammals have it, if not most animals, right? So what we have an advantage over the animals is just with the prefrontal cortex and the ability to delay gratification and the ability to control our impulses, right? So if we can, in the kind of more human part of the brain, understand that there may be this process happening more in the middle, you know, dog-like maybe part of
Mhm.
our brain, then we can exert control over it, depending on the the makeup of your brain. One might be able to control it almost entirely. So
Mhm.
awareness, giving your prefrontal cortex the information in order to control the rest of the brain is certainly super valid technique.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of a good way to kind of bring it back to full circle with kind of everything we've been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
fasting and the motivation and kind of willpower that's needed, to do that, or to follow your goals, or, to decide to work out. All of those things in large part are kind of driven by the prefrontal cortex, and kind of in being able to inhibit those impulses that are saying, go, eat a third bowl of ice cream, or, you don't need to work out today, you've had a long, it's like all those, maybe the voice in our head, um,
Yeah,
being able to sort of override that. Um, I think with everything we've talked about, including this concept of loss aversion being, a super powerful um, ability, right? To have a super strong prefrontal cortex.
yeah, definitely. I think that there's a good chance that if you, on a daily basis, at the least once a day, are able to delay gratification, are able to exert some kind of willful mindfulness over something that you're having trouble with would probably be equivalent to, doing a little bit of weightlifting for the body, something like that. So the more that you can exert willfulness over another part of your brain, then I would see that as a strength building exercise for the mind, certainly.
Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's a great kind of way to wrap up as far as, kind of just summarizing kind of a lot of the key points that we touched on.
Yeah.
Do you have, this is, your chance to, plug whatever kind of resources. I know, you've got your personal coaching. If people are interested in that,
Yeah.
how would they go about contacting you?
You can go to my website, which is unlockyou.org. That's unlock and then YOU.org. And you can get in contact with me there or find me on the street.
Find you on the streets, the hard streets of Eugene.
Yeah, Eugene, Oregon. I'm on campus.
Yeah. Or out, picking veggies from your garden, right?
Yeah.
Probably find you out there a lot too. Cool, man. Well, thank you again for being a guest, on the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast. Please do follow us. Everyone, our Instagram is Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. And also our YouTube channel, Roscoe's Wetsuit. You can find video versions of all the podcasts there. So make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. We also recently just got on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So
nice.
If you got some time and you want to, listen at home, go for it. But now we got the option where you can listen while you're driving or going about your day. So we got you covered in all the directions. So
sweet.
Thanks again, Chris.
You're welcome.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.